All right, let's just dive right into this explainer because we are looking at a truly fascinating, honestly, almost unbelievable transformation today. We're going to trace the evolution of the Taliban from when they first emerged back in the 1990s all the way to their current position of power today. Now, this is a story of absolute extreme contrasts, and our source material gives us this brilliantly structured way to really understand how a ragtag rural militia somehow morphed into a group attempting actual modern statecraft. To really wrap our heads around this monumental shift, our source material actually kicks things off with a deeply personal memory from rural Pakistan in the 1990s. Remember, this was way before the internet connected every single corner of the globe. Back then, the crackling shortwave radio of the BBC World Service was kind of the primary window to the outside world. In fact, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan once called it Britain's greatest gift to the world in the 20th century. It was broadcasting news of global revolutions, falling empires, the birth of the internet. But, amidst all those massive global shifts, that exact same radio also brought the very first mysterious reports of a brand new movement emerging from the dust storms and madrasas of Afghanistan, the Taliban. And guys, the core mystery here is just striking. Early on, news of the Taliban was defined by this incredibly rigid, pre-modern ideology. Our source actually recalls this wild story where a football team from Quetta traveled over to Kandahar for just a friendly match. Well, because the players wore shorts, the Taliban's religious police deemed them immodest. So what did they do? They punished half the team by literally shaving their heads. No way, right? Yet, you fast forward to the 2020s, and this very same group is proudly fielding and celebrating their own national football and cricket teams. I mean, how on earth does a group undergo such a staggering reversal? So, to solve this historical mystery today, we're going to follow a very specific philosophical roadmap. Number 1, the thesis, the first emirate. Number 2, the antithesis, the modern republic. Number 3, the synthesis, the new Taliban. And number 4, we'll look at why this is an incredibly unstable experiment. But before we dig into the history, it's absolutely crucial that we understand this core framework first, which is the Hegelian dialectic. Named after the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, this is basically a tool that perfectly explains how two entirely opposing forces can violently collide to create a deeply contradictory new reality. It works like this. You start with a thesis. It clashes with its complete opposite, the antithesis, and from that conflict, a synthesis is born. So keep this model in the back of your mind as we go, because it is literally the master key to unlocking this whole transformation.
Okay, part 1. The thesis, the first emirate. Let's examine the original Taliban of the 1990s. These early days brilliantly and kind of bizarrely illustrate the absolute absurdity of their pre-modern rural mindset colliding with the modern world. Back in the 90s, they effectively declared war on 20th century modernity. Television sets weren't just banned, sometimes they were literally hung from trees like criminals. Radio was stripped entirely of music, restricted to just motivational chants. And get this, during a blackout, the actual Minister of Electricity was found climbing a pole himself to fix a wire. I mean, it was a purely local village-level approach applied to running a whole nation-state. Oh, and during the hijacked Indian Airlines flight negotiations, when officials were desperately trying to explain the Y2K computer bug to them, the Taliban seriously suggested fixing it by just using, quote, some old computers lying in a room. They were essentially villagers thrown overnight into a century they simply didn't understand.
Moving on to part 2, the antithesis, the modern republic. This represents the 20 years of the American-backed Afghan Republic between 2001 and 2021. To explain this era, our source brings in another fascinating concept from Hegel, which is called the cunning of reason. Basically, this is the idea that historical forces often achieve these broader, overarching ends that are completely unintended by the people actually taking the actions. So, think about it. The American occupation was obviously driven by U.S. national interests, right? But through this cunning of reason, it unintentionally forced a rapid, sweeping modernization across Afghanistan that changed the very fabric of the country forever. Step by step, you can really see how this played out. Following the Western intervention in 2001, Afghanistan saw super rapid urbanization and this sudden explosion of digital connectivity. A booming media environment created a brand new, globally exposed generation. But here is where the dialectic really kicks into high gear. This modernizing republic didn't just transform the urban centers, it transformed the Taliban insurgency itself. To fight this modern state, the Taliban were forced to adapt. They had to start using smartphones, learn encrypted messaging, produce sophisticated propaganda videos, and they even had to learn the complex language of international diplomacy. And that brings us to part 3, the synthesis.
the new Taliban. This is the 2021 return to power where they seem completely unrecognizable.
When you compare these eras side by side, the contrast is just stunning. On one hand, we've got our 1990s thesis, right? That ragtag, isolated, tech-rejecting rural militia. And then you look at the 2021 synthesis. Now you've got the Taliban holding polished press conferences, managing official Twitter accounts, meeting diplomats in Doha, and issuing formal budget statements. It's wild. You can really see how the new Taliban fused their medieval ideological roots with the very tools of modern statecraft that they were forced to learn during those 2 decades of the antithesis. So, the huge takeaway here is that the Taliban didn't burn down the modern house built by the previous government. Nope, they simply moved right into it. They inherited and absorbed a functioning bureaucracy that was largely built by previous Afghan technocrats. Now they're managing modern infrastructure like airports and public utilities. They're operating a central bank. They're maintaining diplomatic channels and global relations. They literally absorbed the bureaucratic machinery of the very state they spent 20 years fighting against. Which leads us to our final section, Part 4, an unstable experiment. Let's look at why this current setup is so incredibly fragile. Like all Hegelian syntheses, this new order is a massive bundle of contradictions, and it's kind of tearing itself apart from the inside. Just look at the friction they're dealing with. They desperately crave international legitimacy, for sure, but they absolutely refuse to compromise their rigid religious worldview. They want foreign investment, yet they still host transnational groups. And their leadership is actively divided. You've got the pragmatic, diplomatic cadre in Doha on one side, and the hardline clerics in Kandahar on the other. Plus, and this might be the biggest thing, you have smartphone-raised youth within their ranks who have completely different instincts than the old guard elders. They're caught right in the middle, wanting to be a modern state, but also wanting to remain a pre-modern religious movement. And as our source material so perfectly points out, these contradictions are already producing their own antitheses. Because the dialectic doesn't just stop, right? It keeps going. The harder the Taliban attempt to enforce their old 1990s certainties, the more vigorously new opposing forces rise up to challenge them. Afghan women who were educated over the last 20 years absolutely refuse to just vanish quietly. You've got a massive global diaspora challenging their legitimacy every single day. And urban youth who grew up with television and the internet are pushing back against leaders trying to resurrect a bygone era. That brings us to Hegel's ultimate grand concept, the Weltgeist, or the world spirit. Hegel believed that history is this moving, unstoppable, overarching progression of human consciousness that simply does not allow for permanent isolation. He actually famously called history a slaughter bench upon which human progression advances. So the Taliban might claim their religious ideology is completely timeless, but our source argues they are actively being reshaped by the exact historical forces they once believed they could completely defy. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought from our explainer today. The Taliban currently stand at a massive crossroads. Are they going to cling to the isolating certainties of the 1990s and risk being totally crushed by history and the pressures of a modernizing world? Or will they recognize the direction of the Weltgeist and align themselves with a future they just can't escape? Honestly, it's a choice that will ultimately determine not just their own survival, but the very destiny of Afghanistan itself.